The year was 1888. The month of January had brought a silence so profound to the Blackwood Valley that you could hear the heartwood of the ancient pines shattering in the darkness. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a world encased entirely in a tomb of solid glass. A meteorological anomaly, known to the old trappers as a white death, and to modern meteorologists as a bomb cyclone, had swept through the mountains. First came the torrential, freezing rain, blinding and relentless. Then, within a single, terrifying hour, the temperature plummeted 40 degrees. Nature did not just freeze the valley. She varnished it in 3 inches of impenetrable, diamond-hard ice. Inside the grandest Victorian mansion in the center of town, Mr. Reginald Sterling, the valley's wealthiest merchant and self-appointed expert on all matters of commerce and civilization, was weeping. He did not weep from sadness, but from a primal, marrow-deep terror. His breath materialized in thick, white plumes inside his own velvet-draped parlor. In the center of the room sat his pride and joy, a magnificent, imported, nickel-plated cast-iron boiler. It was a mechanical marvel that had cost him $300, a fortune that could buy a vast acreage of land. Yet this expensive monument to human engineering was completely, utterly dead, a cold, starving iron beast. Outside his frosted, rattling windows stood Reginald's ultimate symbol of status, 10 massive cords of premium, split oak. For months, they had been perfectly stacked in the open air, a towering fortress of wood meant to show the entire town that the Sterling estate had fuel to burn. But now, that mountain of oak was entombed in a monolithic block of solid ice. Reginald swung a heavy steel splitting axe against the frozen pile. Clang! The metal bounced off the frozen casing, sending a jarring, agonizing shockwave up his soft, uncalloused arms. He swung again, screaming at the sky, his hands blistering. Clang! Not a single splinter broke free. The wood was trapped. His 300-odd boiler was useless. His immense wealth could not negotiate with the brutal, unforgiving laws of thermodynamics. In the face of nature's absolute fury, his paper money was just kindling that burned too fast to save him. Swing the pendulum. Less than 2 miles away, where the fertile town soil gave way to the rocky, undesirable, and wind-battered slopes of the valley's edge, lay a structure so humble it was barely visible beneath the snowdrifts. It was a half-buried earthen dugout, a relic of pioneer desperation. Inside, there was no velvet. There was no nickel-plated iron. There was only the hushed, rhythmic breathing of a woman resting peacefully under a simple wool blanket, her lungs drawing in air that was soft, dry, and perfectly stable. Sitting cross-legged on the floor was 16-year-old Anya. She was not wearing boots. She was not shivering. She was barefoot. Her little brother, Toby, a boy of 5, lay on his stomach nearby, casually arranging small wooden blocks on the slate stones. The thermometer nailed to the earthen wall read a miraculous, unwavering 65 degrees. While the town's elite were trapped in their freezing, ornate wooden mansions, slowly succumbing to hypothermia, Anya's subterranean sanctuary was a bastion of radiant, enveloping warmth. There was no roaring fire visible. There was only a tiny, battered tin stove, scavenged from a scrap heap, burning a meager handful of twigs. Yet, the slate floor beneath her bare feet was radiating a deep, penetrating heat, like a stone left out in the summer sun. Beneath those warm stones, hidden from the mocking eyes of the world, lay Anya's secret. A trench, dug deep into the dirt floor, running the length of the room. Inside that trench lay her entire winter supply of firewood, the damp, rotting, rejected branches she had dragged from the forest floor, but they were no longer damp. Winding through that buried wood was a cheap $1.50 rusted tin exhaust pipe, carrying the waste heat from her tiny stove. While Reginald Sterling's exposed premium oak was frozen solid, Anya was using the waste heat of her own chimney to kiln dry her hidden firewood directly beneath her feet, turning the very earth into a massive, passive thermal battery. She slept atop a mountain of dry fuel, cradled by the warmth of the soil, completely untouched by the apocalyptic storm raging above. How did a marginalized, fatherless 16-year-old girl, burdened with a bedridden mother and a hungry little brother, outsmart the most powerful, educated men in the valley? How did her solution, which cost exactly $1.50 in scrap metal and dirt, defeat a $300 masterpiece of modern heating? To understand the poetic justice of this frozen night, we must rewind the clock to the crisp, unforgiving winds of late autumn. We must return to the days when the valley's elites laughed at a vulnerable girl, mocking her as she dug what they proudly proclaimed would be her own freezing grave. They laughed, blinded by their arrogance, entirely unaware that the earth does not listen to the boasting of men. The earth only responds to those humble enough to understand its laws. Welcome, seekers of the old ways. You have found your way back to the hearth, where we preserve the forgotten wisdom of those who walked before us. I am honored to have you here. If you believe, as I do, that true resilience comes from humility rather than arrogance, I ask that you leave your mark. Subscribe to this channel, leave a like to stoke our fire, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me, from which city are you watching our fire burn today? Leave your location in the comments below so I may know how far the warmth of our ancestral legacy has traveled. Now, let us step back into the biting autumn wind, where a young girl's struggle against the cruelty of men is about to begin. It was late October when the first true warning of winter bled down from the jagged gray peaks. The autumn winds in the Blackwood Valley did not sing. They shrieked, tearing the last brittle leaves from the dying oaks and driving a damp, bone-chilling frost deep into the soil. Through the rutted, frozen mud of the town square, a solitary figure labored against the biting wind. It was Anya. Her boots were worn so thin that she had stuffed the soles with dried prairie grass, desperate to keep the freezing mud from numbing her toes. Over her frail shoulders was slung a thick, frayed hemp rope. She leaned forward, her muscles straining, her breath hanging in the frigid air like white smoke, as she dragged a heavy, makeshift sled fashioned from splintered shipping crates. The sled was piled high with the absolute lowest grade of fuel the forest had to offer. It was a pathetic mound of windfall branches, widowmakers, and rotting pine scraps she had scavenged from the damp, shaded ravines where the sun never reached. The wood was green. It was heavy with sap and saturated with autumn rain. Covered in pale green moss and slick with moisture, it was the kind of wood that would hiss, sputter, and choke a room with blinding, acidic white smoke if cast into a fire. Yet, Anya pulled it with the fierce, unyielding determination of a guardian. She did not drag this miserable cargo for her own comfort. Every agonizing step she took was fueled by the phantom weight of her mother's failing, tubercular lungs, and the delicate, freezing fingers of her 5-year-old brother, Toby. The cold was not merely an inconvenience to her family. It was an executioner waiting patiently at their flimsy wooden door. As she dragged her sled into the affluent heart of Blackwood, the contrast became a physical blow. Here, the streets were paved with neat cobblestones. Gas lamps hissed, casting a warm, golden glow over the storefronts. and towering above it all stood the Sterling Mansion, an imposing structure of dark wood, stained glass, and absolute, arrogant power. Thick, black smoke rolled lazily from its 3 massive brick chimneys, a flagrant display of excess heat being bled into the sky. Standing outside the wrought iron gates were Mr. Reginald Sterling and Mayor Higgins. They wore heavy tailored coats of imported wool and beaver fur. Between their gloved fingers rested expensive cigars, the fragrant blue smoke mingling with the crisp autumn air. They were not looking at the sky. They were admiring Reginald's monument to his own wealth, a colossal, perfectly geometric wall of premium, straight-grained white oak. 10 cords of it. It was a fortress of fuel, stacked proudly in the open air, utterly exposed to the elements. Anya's sled hit a deep, frozen rut in the cobblestone. The violent jolt snapped a weak piece of twine, sending half a dozen heavy, wet, mossy logs tumbling onto the pristine street, right at the feet of the 2 wealthy men. Anya gasped, her numb hand scrambling to gather the damp wood. Reginald Sterling did not offer to help. Instead, he stepped forward, using the silver tip of his walking cane to casually flip one of Anya's wet logs over. He looked down at the kneeling girl, his eyes entirely devoid of pity, filled only with the cold calculation of a ledger book. "Tell me, child," Reginald's voice boomed, carrying across the silent street. "What exactly do you intend to do with this miserable wet sponge?" Anya kept her eyes on the cobblestones, her cheeks burning with humiliation. "It's for the winter, Mr. Sterling, to keep my mother warm." Mayor Higgins let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Warm? With that? That isn't firewood, girl. That is a puddle of water wrapped in tree bark." Reginald smiled a thin, bloodless smile. He relished the opportunity to lecture the poor on their own misery. "The mayor is correct, Anya. You see, this is the problem with your kind. You lack the intellect for basic foresight. Water does not burn. To boil the moisture out of this pathetic green wood, your tiny rusted stove will expend all of its energy. You will get 0 heat. You will simply sit in a freezing dirt hole, coughing on white smoke until your mother's weak lungs finally give out." He was speaking the language of physics, twisting the truth of thermodynamics into a weapon of social cruelty. The villain was attacking her logic, placing the very doubts of the civilized world squarely onto her fragile shoulders. How could wet wood possibly provide heat? "Look upon this," Reginald commanded, sweeping his cane toward his massive, exposed wall of oak. "Felled in the spring, split by paid laborers in the summer, stacked here in the open air, precisely as the modern experts advise, so the autumn winds may draw the moisture out. That is how civilized, educated men conquer the winter. With preparation. With capital." Anya swallowed hard, the lump of desperation thick in her throat. She looked at the towering wall of dry oak. Just 5 of those logs could keep Toby warm for a week. "Mr. Sterling," Anya whispered, her voice trembling but unbroken. Could you spare an advance? Just 1 bundle of dry wood? Just until my wood has time to dry? I will work it off. I can scrub your floors. Please, the frost is coming tonight." Reginald's smile vanished. The mask of the benevolent educator fell away, revealing the ruthless gatekeeper of the elite. "Poverty, my dear girl, is merely a symptom of poor planning and a weak lineage," he said coldly. "I paid $300 for my new nickel-plated boiler. I paid $50 for this seasoned oak. I will not subsidize your ignorance. If I give you my wood, you will never learn the harsh, necessary lessons of industry." "She lives in a half-dug trench on the ridge," Mayor Higgins sneered, adjusting his top hat. "Let her live like a badger. The Farmer's Almanac predicts a brutal freeze by December. There'll be frozen statues before Christmas, Reginald. Don't waste your breath. Learn how civilized people live, Anya, Reginald finalized, turning his back on her to admire his exposed, vulnerable woodpile once more. Or let the winter claim you. They walked away, their laughter echoing off the cold stones. Anya remained on her knees for a long moment. She did not cry. The freezing wind whipped her hair across her face, drying the tears before they could even form. She looked at the wet, useless wood in her hands. The men were right about one thing. Water does not burn. If she put this wood into her tiny tin stove as it was, her family would freeze to death. But as she tied the damp logs back onto her sled, a quiet, fierce defiance ignited in her chest. Reginald Sterling possessed a $300 boiler and a mountain of arrogance. He trusted the open air and the modern experts. Anya had nothing but a dirt floor, $1.50 to her name, and the whispered memories of her grandfather's ancient wisdom. She gripped the hemp rope, hauling her wet wood away from the grand mansions, back toward the rocky ridge. She was not going to build a monument to wealth. She was going to build a trap for the heat, and she was going to hide it right beneath the very earth they despised. When Anya finally returned to the rocky ridge, the pale autumn sun had already surrendered to the horizon. She pushed open the heavy, patchwork wooden door of their half-buried dugout. Inside, the air was agonizingly thin and terribly cold. From the shadows of the far corner, a ragged, wet cough echoed against the dirt walls. It was her mother, her chest rattling with the unmistakable, hollow sound of advanced consumption. Beside the bed, 5-year-old Toby sat wrapped in a threadbare blanket, his lips tinged with a faint, terrifying shade of blue. Anya looked at the miserable pile of wet, mossy wood she had dragged miles to bring home. Reginald Sterling's cruel words echoed in her ears. Water does not burn. You will simply sit in a freezing dirt hole. For a fleeting moment, despair threatened to crush her. The modern experts, the wealthy men with their imported $300 iron boilers, had spoken. But as Anya knelt on the cold, packed dirt floor of her home, she pressed her bare palm against the soil. It was cool, but it was not freezing. The wind howled furiously above the roof, but down here, half swallowed by the earth, there was a profound, heavy silence. It was in that silence that the ancestral memory awoke. She remembered her late grandfather, a weathered pioneer who had crossed the ocean with nothing but the clothes on his back and the ancient knowledge of his forebears. He used to sit by a tiny fire, tracing lines in the ashes with a stick, whispering to a young Anya about the old world. He spoke of the Roman hippocausts, hidden fires that heated the floors of ancient bathhouses without choking the rooms with smoke. He spoke of the earth lodges of the native tribes, who understood that the sky is a thief of heat, but the earth is a faithful guardian. Modern men, her grandfather had told her, build tall, straight chimneys to throw their fire into the sky. They burn forests to warm the clouds, and they call it civilization. The air steals, Anya. The air takes everything. But the earth? The earth remembers the warmth you give it. Anya stood up. She did not need $300. She did not need premium oak. She only needed the earth, and she needed physics. The very next morning, before the sun rose, Anya took a rusted, iron-headed spade and began to break the dirt floor of her own home. It was grueling, back-breaking labor for a 16-year-old girl. Blisters formed, burst, and bled on her palms, but she did not stop. Down the center of the rectangular dugout, she dug a trench 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, running the entire length of the room. When the trench was finished, she walked 2 miles to the town's scrapyard. In her pocket, she carried her life savings, $1.50 in tarnished coins. She bypassed the expensive cast iron grates and heavy boilers. Instead, she pointed to a stack of dented, rusted tin stovepipes. For $1.50, she bought 15 feet of cheap, thin metal tubing. Back in the dugout, Anya began her masterclass in low-tech, ancestral engineering. Normally, a stovepipe is attached to the top of a firebox and runs vertically straight through the roof. This is the modern, expert way, but it is a tragedy of thermodynamics. Up to 70% of a fire's energy, smoke gas burning at 400 degrees, 200 degrees, is violently sucked up the chimney and wasted into the freezing winter sky. Anya refused to waste a single degree. Instead of routing her pipe upward, she connected it to the back of her tiny, battered tin stove and directed it downward. She ran the thin tin pipe directly into the bottom of the earthen trench. She laid it horizontally along the dirt floor for 12 feet, and only at the far end of the room did the pipe turn upward, exiting through a small hole in the roof to create the necessary draft. Next, she took her miserable, wet, green firewood. The wood that Reginald Sterling had sworn would freeze her family. She climbed down into the trench and began stacking the damp wood tightly around the horizontal tin pipe. She filled the entire trench with her wet fuel. Finally, she walked to the dry riverbed and carried back dozens of heavy, flat slate stones. She laid these stones meticulously over the top of the trench, sealing it shut and creating a smooth, flat rock floor down the center of her home. The physics of her Zagiroifty contraption were brilliant, operating on two immutable laws of nature, the Kiln effect and thermal mass. When Anya lit a small, hot fire in her stove using dry twigs, the draft pulled the 400-degree exhaust smoke down into the buried tin pipe. As that blistering heat traveled horizontally beneath the floor, it radiated violently into the trench. The buried trench instantly became a subterranean kiln. The intense, trapped heat baked the wet, mossy wood stacked around the pipe. The water inside the green wood boiled, evaporating into vapor that slowly seeped out through the microscopic cracks in the slate stones, humidifying the dry winter air of the dugout. Within a week, the waste heat of her tiny stove had entirely baked the moisture out of her wood. It went from a damp, useless 50% moisture content to a bone-dry, perfect 0%. She was using her fire's own garbage exhaust to manufacture premium fuel. But the brilliance did not stop there. The heat radiating from the trench was absorbed by the heavy slate stones she had laid on top. Stone and earth have a massive thermal inertia. They take a long time to heat up, but once warm, they hold that heat for days. Instead of the heat escaping into the ceiling, the slate floor became a massive, passive radiator. It emitted a constant, gentle, unwavering 65 degrees at 18 degrees, upward, warming the feet, the beds, and the very bones of her family. Anya had engineered a miracle. A week later, a polished black carriage stopped on the ridge. Reginald Sterling stepped down, wrapping his beaver fur coat tight against the biting November wind. He had come to collect a trivial $2 land lease fee, a cruel formality he enjoyed enforcing upon the poorest residents of the valley. He pushed open the door of the dugout, expecting to find misery and the stinging smell of acrid smoke. Instead, he was hit by a wall of soft, enveloping, profoundly stable warmth. He blinked, confused, looking around the humble, dirt-walled room. There was no roaring fire, only a tiny, gentle flame visible through the cracks of the battered stove. Then he watched as Anya knelt on the floor. She lifted one of the flat slate stones. From beneath the earth, a wave of dry heat rolled out. She reached into the dark trench and pulled out a log. It was the same rotting, mossy wood she had dragged through town a week prior, but now it was feather-light, bone-white, and perfectly, immaculately dry. She tossed it into the stove, where it caught fire instantly, burning with a bright, clean, smokeless blue and orange flame. Reginald stared at the hole in the floor. His mind, conditioned by the arrogance of academia and wealth, furiously rejected what his eyes were seeing. He pointed his silver-tipped cane at the trench, his voice dripping with condescension. "What is this madness, girl? You buried your wood in the damp earth? It will rot and turn to compost. The soil is wet." "The heat from the exhaust pipe dries the soil, Mr. Sterling," Anya replied quietly, not looking up as she replaced the warm stone. "And the pipe dries the wood." "Nonsense," Reginald scoffed, his face turning red with indignation. He was the expert. He owned the $300 boiler. "Smoke rises, girl. It is a law of nature. By forcing your exhaust down into a hole, you have ruined the vertical draft of your chimney. You will choke your stove, and the carbon will back up into this room and suffocate your miserable family in your sleep. It is a death trap built by an ignorant child." He was shouting his doubts, desperate to assert his superiority. How could a pipe go down and still draw smoke? He did not understand that the initial upward section of her chimney, heated by the fire, created enough vacuum to pull the smoke through the horizontal pipe below. He did not understand the fluid dynamics of hot gases. He only knew what the catalogs told him to buy. Anya stood slowly. She reached into her pocket, pulled out 2 crumpled dollar bills, and handed them to the wealthy merchant. "The draft works perfectly, sir," she said softly, her voice carrying the solemn weight of the earth itself. "Because the fire wants to breathe, and the earth knows how to hold its breath. I have paid my lease. Good day, Mr. Sterling." Reginald snatched the money, his lip curling in disgust. "You are playing in the dirt, peasant. Enjoy your warm mud while you can. When the true freeze comes, your little floor trick will shatter. We shall see who understands the winter then." He turned and stormed out into the freezing wind, climbing into his carriage. As he rode back down the mountain, toward his grand mansion and his 10 exposed cords of premium oak, he laughed at the foolishness of the poor. He did not look at the sky. If he had, he would have noticed that the pale afternoon sun had vanished, swallowed by a bruise-colored wall of violent, purple clouds rolling over the jagged peaks. The sky was not just getting dark. It was dying. The bomb cyclone had arrived. It began not with a howl, but with a terrifying, unnatural silence. The birds had vanished from the Blackwood Valley 2 days prior, guided by an instinct that no amount of human wealth could buy. Then, the sky turned the color of a fresh, deep bruise, a sickening, heavy purple that swallowed the afternoon sun whole. The bomb cyclone did not announce itself with snow. It announced itself with water. A torrential, freezing rain began to fall, driven horizontally by a wind that felt like invisible blades. For 3 hours, the supercooled water battered the town, soaking every roof, every cobblestone, and every exposed pile of premium oak. And then, the bottom fell out of the world. In less than 60 minutes, the temperature plummeted a staggering 40 degrees, diving far below zero. The howling wind shifted into a screaming, demonic roar. The valley did not just freeze, it flash froze. The torrential rain that had soaked the town instantly crystallized. Everything was varnished in 3 inches of impenetrable, diamond-hard ice. It was the White Death. Swing the pendulum. Inside the Sterling mansion, the grand illusion of civilized superiority was shattering. Mr. Reginald Sterling paced his velvet-draped parlor in a panic, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. The wind screamed against his towering single-pane glass windows, bowing the frames. Ice was forming inside the house, creeping up the ornate wallpaper. His massive, drafty Victorian home, built to impress the eyes rather than to trap heat, was bleeding its warmth into the apocalyptic sky at a terrifying rate. He needed a roaring fire, and he needed it now. Swing the pendulum. 2 miles away, buried into the side of the rocky ridge, the earth absorbed the fury of the storm. The wind raged above the roof of the dugout, trying to tear the structure apart, but it could not grasp the earth. Inside, there was no velvet, no imported rugs. There was only a profound, heavy silence, broken gently by the rhythmic, easy breathing of a mother finally finding rest. Anya sat barefoot on the slate stones. Beneath her, the buried tin pipe was quietly channeling the 400-degree of exhaust of a handful of dry twigs. The trench was a subterranean oven, baking the earth. The massive thermal inertia of the dirt and stone had absorbed the heat for weeks, and now, when the air above had turned murderous, the floor was violently radiating that stored energy back into the room. The thermometer nailed to the wall did not drop a single degree. It held steady, unyielding, at a perfect, life-saving 65-degree shift. She was entirely disconnected from the chaos of the sky. Swing the pendulum. Reginald Sterling threw open his heavy oak front door and was instantly thrown backward by a blast of sub-zero wind. He pulled his beaver fur coat tight and fought his way down the icy steps toward his magnificent 10-cord woodpile, the $50 monument to his foresight. He raised his lantern. The light reflected off a monolithic block of solid ice. The supercooled rain had seeped into every crack, every gap between the perfectly stacked logs, and then frozen solid. His wood was entombed. Panic seized his chest. He grabbed a heavy splitting axe and swung with all his might. Clang! The steel bounced off the casing, the vibration tearing a scream from his throat as his hands blistered. He swung again and again, hacking like a madman until the wooden handle splintered. Finally, he managed to pry 3 pitiful, ice-encased logs loose from the frozen mountain. He staggered back inside, his face pale, his hands bleeding. He carried the freezing wood to his $300 nickel-plated cast-iron boiler. The fire inside was already dying, struggling against the freezing draft dropping down the wide, straight chimney. Reginald shoved the ice-covered logs into the firebox and slammed the iron door shut. He expected a roar. He expected the brute force of his expensive machine to conquer the cold. Instead, he received a brutal, unforgiving lesson in the absolute laws of thermodynamics. When you introduce ice and water into a combustion chamber, the fire must first act as a boiler before it can act as a heater. It requires a massive, incalculable amount of energy, known in physics as the latent heat of vaporization, to force solid ice to melt, and then to force that water to boil into steam. Inside the $300 boiler, 70% of the remaining fire's thermal energy was instantly hijacked. The heat was not transferring to the cast iron to warm the room. It was being consumed entirely by the ice. The flames hissed, sputtered, and turned a sickly, suffocated yellow. The temperature in the firebox plummeted. Because the fire was now starved of heat, combustion became incomplete. The wood did not burn. It smoldered, releasing a dense, acidic, unburned gas. This wet, black smoke crawled up into the freezing brick chimney. The moment those hot gases hit the sub-zero bricks, they instantly condensed, rapidly painting the inside of the flue with thick, highly flammable, tar-like creosote. Within 20 minutes, the chimney was choked. The draft completely died. The $300 boiler began to belch thick, blinding, bitter black smoke back into the parlor. Reginald coughed violently, his eyes stinging, falling to his knees as the poisonous fog filled his grand mansion. The room temperature dropped to freezing. Desperate, utterly terrified, Reginald committed his final act of hubris. He grabbed a can of kerosene from the pantry and splashed it directly onto the smoldering wet wood inside the boiler, throwing a lit match after it. Whoosh! A sudden, violent spike of localized, intense heat flared inside the firebox, but the thick cast iron of the boiler was freezing cold on the outside. Physics is merciless. When metal is rapidly heated on one side while remaining frozen on the other, the molecules expand at vastly different rates. The stress becomes absolute. A sound like a gunshot rang out through the smoke-filled parlor. Crack. A massive, jagged fissure tore down the side of the $300 imported boiler. The expensive, nickel-plated iron split entirely in half, rendered utterly useless by thermal shock. The beast was dead. Reginald Sterling, the wealthiest man in Blackwood Valley, the man who had mocked a 16-year-old girl for playing in the dirt, collapsed onto his expensive, freezing rug. His 10 cords of premium oak were a block of ice outside. His $300 stove was a broken piece of scrap metal. His paper money could not burn hot enough to save him. The elite had been defeated by their own arrogance. Nature had audited their wealth and found them completely bankrupt. As the temperature in the mansion dropped toward zero, Reginald heard the terrified, shivering cries of his own children from the floor above. He realized, with a soul-crushing wave of humiliation, that there was only one place in the entire valley where a fire was still burning perfectly dry. He had to walk to the ridge. He had to beg for his life from the girl he had told to freeze. The journey from the center of town to the rocky ridge was only 2 miles, but in the heart of the bomb cyclone, it was an eternity of white, screaming agony. Mr. Reginald Sterling, the man who had built his entire identity upon the accumulation of paper wealth and the mockery of the poor, was now a refugee in his own town. He staggered through the knee-deep, blinding snowdrifts, leaning heavily into the violent wind. His expensive beaver fur coat, once a symbol of his untouchable status, was frozen stiff, offering no more protection than a sheet of paper. Clinging tightly to his chest were his 2 young children, wrapped in every woolen blanket he could find in his freezing, dark mansion. Their lips were blue. Their shivering had begun to slow down, a terrifying physiological sign that their core temperatures were dropping dangerously close to the point of no return. Behind him, his grand Victorian home stood as a dark, freezing mausoleum. His $300 imported boiler lay cracked and dead. His $50 mountain of premium, perfectly seasoned oak was entombed in solid ice, entirely inaccessible. He had trusted the modern experts. He had trusted the open air. He had trusted his money to insulate him from the consequences of nature. Nature had declined his currency. Every step up the ridge was a physical and psychological torment. Reginald remembered his own words, spat at Anya just weeks ago. Let her live like a badger. There'll be frozen statues before Christmas. He fully expected to arrive at the half-buried dugout only to find a frozen tomb. He expected to find the girl and her family claimed by the very winter he had told them to surrender to. But he had nowhere else to go. His pride had been stripped away by the absolute, merciless laws of thermodynamics. Through the roaring whiteout, a faint amber glow appeared. It was the small, frosted window of the dirt dugout. Reginald fell to his knees before the heavy, patchwork wooden door. He did not knock with the silver tip of his cane. He had dropped that useless piece of vanity a mile back. He pounded on the rough wood with his bare, blistered, freezing fists, sobbing against the howling wind. "Please," he screamed, his voice swallowed by the storm. "Please, God, help us." The heavy latch lifted. The door creaked open. Reginald braced himself for the bitter cold of a dead room. Instead, as the door swung inward, he was violently struck by a physical wave of thick, enveloping, radiant heat. It was not the sharp, localized, burning heat of a roaring open fire. It was the deep, heavy, stable warmth of a midsummer afternoon. It was exactly 65 degrees. Standing in the doorway was 16-year-old Anya. She was still barefoot. Her cheap, threadbare dress fluttered gently in the thermal draft escaping into the storm. Behind her, the dugout was bathed in a soft, peaceful, golden light. Her mother was sleeping soundly, breathing easily. Little Toby was asleep on the floor, his cheek resting directly against the warm, bare slate stones. Reginald looked up at the girl he had publicly humiliated. He looked at the dirt floor he had called a death trap. He fell forward, collapsing just inside the doorway, shielding his shivering children. He waited for the mockery. He waited for the triumphant sneer, the demand for a pound of flesh, the righteous vengeance he knew he deserved. He waited for her to point out that his $300 machine was broken, while her $1.50 scrap metal pipe had conquered the apocalypse. Anya looked down at the wealthiest man in the valley, a man broken, humbled, and brought to his knees by his own arrogance. She saw the terror in his eyes. She saw the blue lips of his innocent children. She did not smile. She did not gloat. True guardians of knowledge do not use their wisdom as a weapon to destroy. They use it as a shield to protect. Without a single word of reproach, Anya stepped aside. She reached down, took the freezing children from his arms, and gently guided them to the center of the room. She laid them down directly on top of the hidden trench. The moment the children's bodies touched the slate, a profound sigh of relief escaped their lips. The massive thermal battery of the Earth, heated by the very exhaust smoke that Reginald had called ignorant, began to rapidly pump life-saving, passive radiant heat into their freezing bloodstreams. The stones held the warmth of 100 hidden, bone-dry logs. Reginald crawled toward the center of the room, his frozen hands pressing flat against the slate floor. The heat seeped into his bones, carrying with it a devastating revelation. Beneath these stones lay the damp, rotting, scavenged wood he had laughed at, and beneath these stones ran the cheap, rusted tin pipe that he swore would suffocate her. He looked at the tiny tin stove. It was burning a single, perfectly dried log with a pristine, smokeless blue flame. The fire was quiet, efficient, and completely self-sustaining. I was wrong," Reginald whispered, the tears freezing on his cheeks, finally melting and dropping onto the warm stone. "My wood is ice. My boiler is cracked. All my money. It couldn't buy a single degree of this heat." How did you know?" Anya sat back down beside her little brother, pulling a wool blanket over Reginald's children. "You trusted the catalogs, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice soft, devoid of malice but heavy with the ancient truth of the earth. "You trusted the men who build monuments to the sky. But the sky is a thief. My grandfather taught me that the earth is a mother. If you are humble enough to ask for her help, and wise enough not to waste what she gives you, she will never let you freeze. The heat doesn't belong to the rich. It belongs to those who know how to catch it." Swing the pendulum. Outside, the bomb cyclone raged on, indiscriminately destroying the frail, exposed wooden castles of the valley's elite. But down in the dirt, anchored in the silent, profound wisdom of the ancestors, a marginalized girl had created an unbreakable sanctuary. She had used $1.50, a few yards of dirt, and the immutable laws of thermodynamics to humiliate the arrogance of modern wealth. She had hidden her firewood in a floor trench, and she slept at 65 degrees while the experts burned ice. My friends, the fire burns low, and our story for tonight comes to an end. We live in a world that constantly tries to sell us our own survival. They build machines of unimaginable cost, engineered to fail, and they mock the simple, the self-reliant, and the humble. They tell us that if we do not spend, we will perish. But the laws of physics do not read bank statements. The earth does not care about the balance of your ledger. True resilience is not bought in a showroom. It is built with your own hands, guided by the forgotten wisdom of those who survived long before the cult of money took hold. If this story has warmed your spirit as Anya's floor warmed that freezing night, then join our resistance. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a like to keep this knowledge alive in the algorithm, and share this video with someone who understands that the old ways are still the best ways. And before you leave the hearth, tell me, from what city did you watch this fire burn today? Leave your location in the comments and let us see how far the legacy of the humble has spread across the map. Until next time, stay warm, stay humble, and remember, the earth always remembers the heat you give it.